pod listeners, welcome back to Urban Roots, the podcast that preserves place through story. I'm your host, Deqah Wetzel, and oh, do we have a treat for you today. A conversation all about equitable development with Bree Jones. Bree is the founder and CEO of Parity, an equitable development company headquartered in West Baltimore that acquires and rehabilitates abandoned properties by the block to create affordable home ownership opportunities. Bree and the folks at Parity have envisioned a new way to develop, one that disengages from traditional top-down forms of planning to combat gentrification and other historical place-based inequities, such as America's legacy of urban renewal. Through this new approach, Bree has successfully generated more than $60 million of investment that has gone back into Black communities. This episode was made possible thanks to our sponsors at Loyola University's Maryland Selinger School of Business and Management. Loyola University Maryland is a Baltimore-based institution that believes in the power of community builders. Not only are they advocates for affordable housing, but they're also champions of Bree Jones' equitable preservation-based development work at Parity and support the Urban Roots podcast in amplifying the voices and stories of on-the-ground changemakers. In this episode, Bree and I discuss the various levels of economic disinvestment that have created hyper-vacancy and decay. Instead of pushing people out of their legacy lands and neighborhoods, Bree, who started Parity in 2020, did that as a response to the gentrification and displacement that she experienced in her hometown. Since then, Bree's work has been recognized as a leader for systems change that revalues Black neighborhoods and engenders Black wealth. If you haven't already, we recommend you watch her TED Talk, How to Revitalize a Neighborhood Without Gentrification. You can find that link in our show notes. Without further ado, let's get into my insightful conversation with one of my professional heroes, Bree Jones. Thank you for coming on, Bree.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I was just reading up more about Urban Roots and what you guys do and the stories you tell. I'm just like, all right, this was meant to be.
Yeah, and actually, for me, I personally am a little selfish in when I select interviewees for the bonus episodes because I want to talk to people who will I can learn from. So, okay, before we dive too far into all the great things that you do, tell us who you are and what you do.
My name is Bree Jones. I'm the founder and CEO of an equitable development company called Parity Homes. I titled the company Parity because when I was kind of setting out, I knew that I really wanted to focus on homeownership as a wealth builder, but particularly I wanted to narrow the racial wealth disparity. And we know that for the average American, your wealth is tied up in your home. And because of things like redlining and urban renewal, we'll get into all of that, Black Americans have not had the opportunity to build wealth through homeownership. So I was asking myself, well, what's the opposite of disparity? And I was really sitting there for 10 minutes, and I Googled it and I was like, oh, parity, duh. And the URL was free. Parity Homes was free. And I grabbed that URL and that's how Parity, that was the origin of the name. We're based out of Baltimore. Baltimore has 15,000 vacant buildings concentrated in Black communities because of redlining, urban renewal, blockbusting, all the things we know. And it's really difficult once you have that level of vacancy. It's extremely hard to regenerate any type of economic activity or housing market. And so what Parity does is we acquire vacant buildings by the block. So currently we own 50 vacant buildings. We act as our own GC, so we renovate those vacant buildings. But I think what's kind of made our model stand apart is that we pre-sell all of our homes to our collective. And these are people who are basically dedicated to creating intentional communities and equitably revitalizing historically Black spaces in a way that centers the experiences of people who have already been there. So I'll go deeper into all of that, but that's who Parity is in a nutshell.
Okay. And GC, you mean general contractor?
General contractor, yes.
I'm kind of curious about your staff. What are some of the pieces that go into play with the work that you're doing and how do you accomplish it?
Yeah. So I've often thought to myself, man, we could be a two-person shop and do 10 houses a year and just coast off into the sunset and be good with that. But our big ambitious goal is to scale. I would love if we could do 200 homes per year. It's going to take everything every brain cell, every fiber in my body to get that done. But if we could do 200 homes per year, just like think of the catalytic impact in a city that has 15,000 vacant buildings. And so I've really been building my team with that end goal in mind. So building the team with where I want to be and not where I am right now. And so we have 6 full-time people, myself, 2 construction staff, 2 sales people, essentially, both someone who is like a counselor who prepares our home buyers for mortgage, and then someone who's out kind of talking to people and spreading the word. And then we just brought on board a marketing person because historically we've done barely any Instagram, no paid ads, basically just not efficient at getting the word out. So we have 6 full-time based out of Baltimore, and then we have 6 consultants who are based throughout the world who help with things like construction budgets and construction administration. And because it's very, very, very complex to be doing multiple properties at once.
Could you tell me about the impetus behind Parity? When was it founded and how have your initial goals evolved over time?
Yes. Okay. Well, let me maybe start with a little bit of my story. So I'm from New York originally. My parents grew up in the Bronx. I was born in the Bronx, and I lived there until I was about 6 or 7 years old. My mom moved us to New Rochelle, New York, when I was a little girl. She moved to New Rochelle because it was one of the last affordable places, within an hour to Manhattan that you could own a home, raise a family, and send your child to a good public school. And so I had a great, great childhood, like everything like that's necessary for a healthy upbringing I had. My mom did an amazing job. And so went to high school, went to college, started my career on Wall Street. Parity got started because there were a few threads. One, I was working on Wall Street. I was kind of getting this really robust career in finance, really understanding how money works, how money moves. Started at Morgan Stanley, then I went to a hedge fund, then I went into VC. And if I had stayed on that trajectory, would be making probably too much money right now. Simultaneously, I had this like entrepreneurship bug. I had always wanted to start my own thing. I didn't know what though, like what I wanted to do. But then all of that kind of came into context when Trayvon Martin was murdered, which for me, I was like maybe 21 years old. That was kind of like my George Floyd moment where my eyes just kind of opened to the world. And it just really contextualized a lot for me. I was like on this upward trajectory in my career, but I couldn't get over the fact that Trayvon could have been my little brother. He could have been my son. And Trayvon was in his neighborhood. Like he was in his home, in his
Yeah.
place where he should have been safe. And it made me realize that there's no amount of personal success or personal wealth I could achieve that would insulate me or my people from being murdered, as long as we continue to exist in places that don't value us. It kind of got me thinking about place and space and when it works and when it doesn't, and just being really curious about what it would look like if Black folks had a space that was intentionally designed for them, where the assumption is that they belong there and not that they are an intruder. And so I had been saving up to purchase my first home. At this point, I was maybe 24. I had been saving up to buy my first home, and there was a vacant property in the town over Mount Vernon, New York, for folks who may know. And I was able to buy that property that had been sitting vacant for over 10 years at a really affordable price point because the listing agent had made a mistake on the listing. They said incorrectly that there was still an oil tank in the ground. And I did some basic research and found that there was not an oil tank in the ground. And so I got a really good price on that house, and I probably wouldn't have been able to buy it otherwise. I did a flow gut renovation on it using all of my own cash. I was in that house pretty much every day with my tool belt and my little construction boots. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Like everything that could go wrong went wrong. But in the end, I was able to build a really beautiful home. It's a 3 unit building. And because I was able to get that house affordably, I was able to pass on the savings to my residents who still to this day live in that home, paying way below market rate rent in a neighborhood that has otherwise gentrified. So I bought that house in 2016 for like 200,000. And today, houses in the neighborhood are appraising at $1 million. So these are the patterns of gentrification that we see in historically Black communities. It started in Brooklyn, it went to Harlem. People thought it would never go past Harlem into the Bronx. It's now in the Bronx, it's in Mount Vernon. And so my whole thesis at that point was just like, okay, we know that there's these patterns that keep happening. There's decades or centuries of intentional race-based disinvestment that devalues Black homes, Black neighborhoods, but actually Black communities are on some of the most intrinsically valuable land. And if we're able to get ahead of those patterns of gentrification, we can actually really ensure that when there is reinvestment, it's healthy and it centers the people who live there. It doesn't displace, it doesn't harm. And from that project in New York, I asked myself, okay, can I do this full time? Can I do this at scale? And that's kind of where Parity was born. And although I had that rental in New York, I knew I didn't want to just focus on rentals moving forward. I wanted to focus on home ownership because when I bought that house, all of my friends were like, Bree, how did you do that? I don't like, I could never buy a house. And I'm like, actually, you can. You totally can. Like, it was more psychological than it was financial, why people were saying they couldn't own a home. But because, again, two-thirds of the average American's wealth is in their home, I'm like, we have to be buying a home. It helps stabilize and it helps build legacy, you know? So I really wanted Parity to be focusing on home ownership.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we'll get into this a little bit more where the work you do is on older buildings, so there's
Hmm. Yeah,
preservation type of
preservation.
work. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's very involved and it's
Very.
complicated. It kind of depends if the building might be in a historic district or not, what rules you have to follow. But I don't think that people have to have an extensive amount of knowledge about that. But even the idea of rehabbing a home or fixing up a home ownership is scary for a lot of
It
people.
is. Yeah.
So couple things that come to mind is why do this in West Baltimore? What was going through your head at the time after the work on the building in New York? What was it about the city that drew you to it?
Yeah. So, all right. So I did the project successfully in New York. And I really had a moment where I was kind of having a conversation with myself like, do you think you could do this, Ray? Can you do this? I think you could do it. And it was like, all right, are we about to jump off the deep end? And I was like, let's do it. And for me, it was like worst case scenario, it doesn't work. I'll just go back to Wall Street, you know? And so my whole thesis was, all right, I don't want to be in markets like New York where you're bidding against all of these like all cash investors. Cause even in 2016, this was pre-pandemic, pre like 1% interest rates. Like every time I tried to bid on a property, I was immediately outbid. And I was just like, all right, that for me, I don't have the pockets to like be in these aggressive markets. So my whole thought was, all right, well, where have markets not yet heated up? Like, where can we get ahead of this? If markets are hot because there's no supply, meaning that there's no parcel, demand, the supply demand curve, then let's go to markets where there's an overage of supply, meaning a ton of vacant buildings and there's not enough demand. Let's see if we could do something there. So I looked at, cities like Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, which are all amazing cities. I drove to every single one and just tried to get the heartbeat of the city. But I remember I pulled up in Baltimore and I just was just driving around the city and I was like, oh, okay, this feels like home. This reminds me of Harlem. It reminds me of the Bronx, like seeing the beautiful row homes, which in New York we call brownstones. I was just like, all right, I think I found my new place. And the other thing that Baltimore has going for it, I mean, there's a lot of amazing things. I know Baltimore doesn't have a great narrative in the press, but if you actually give it a chance and you go to the city, it's like the most amazing place. It's such a charming place. Kind people, like warm and friendly, beautifully designed neighborhoods, historic neighborhoods. I mean, even though the houses are dilapidated, they were built in the 1800s by like the world's premier masonry workers and carpenters. And it's on Route 95. It's between New York, Philly, and DC. So it's in an economic corridor. It's a port city, and it is an amazing jobs and economic center, which is really important as a developer. It's not enough to just say, I'm going to build my houses affordably. The question is, are people being paid well enough at their companies that they can afford housing? And so Baltimore has what we call the EDS, Meds and TEDs. Eds are universities, meds are hospitals and medical centers, and the TEDs are like the technical companies, biomedical tech, things like that. It has the defense industry because it's right, next to Washington, D.C. So there's Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, BWI, which is the airport. Again, it's a port city. So it has like the Amazon distribution center. There's just so many economic opportunities. So it just felt like an amazing place to try this out. And I don't regret the decision. I think it was absolutely the right one.
Actually, as you're talking about Baltimore, it reminds me of when I visited Baltimore because two of my friends had moved there. They were working in DC, but wanted to live somewhere where they could afford living in a row house. And they ended up moving to Baltimore and spending time there. I was like, oh my gosh, this place is quite a lot like Cincinnati.
Yeah.
And then for myself, my husband and I, before I met him and before we got married or anything, he had went in with a friend and purchased a older home. The home was built in 1888 for a very affordable price, but it was like they had, he's actually very, I'm fortunate to have a very handy person in my life, somebody who can not only tackle the plumbing issues that we would have in the house because old pipes, but also had to completely tear apart and put in new floors. And so I would say now, though, it's a very modest income home and
Mm-hmm.
it's, we still own it. And I think a lot about the difficulty of doing all of that on our own.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think that what you provide with Parity is really neat and innovative because you're kind of taking some of that hard work, doing it yourself, and then giving people what they have always deserved, a nice, beautiful, safe, clean home.
It's 100% right. I think you had asked me a little where you kind of mentioned it earlier, like if there was something I would do differently or for someone else, like if you're a solo person and like construction and renovation is not what you plan to make your forever job, I would have started, if I could do it differently, I would have started with the home that didn't need a full gut renovation because it's one of those things like you're like, "Oh, I could do that." It is actually probably the most difficult thing you'll ever do in your life, and that's in large part because it's really hard to find a good general contractor, and they're worth their weight in gold. Like unless you know how to physically do the work yourself. So I would have started with the house that needed less work, like maybe just like a fresh coat of paint and a new kitchen, and started there because there's just way when you're doing a full gut, you really are putting yourself at serious risk that the project doesn't work the way you want it to. So for me, like I was maybe three quarters of the way through the project, $150,000 in, which was all that I had for the entire construction budget. And my GC was like, "Oh, actually, we're going to need another $100,000 to finish this house." And I'm like, mind you, I'm like 25 at this point. I'm like, where am I going to find another $100,000? But it's like, but if you don't get the house done, then you can't, refinance it. You can't get tenants in. So there was a point where I missed three mortgage payments and the bank was about to foreclose. It was a mess. So we're good now. But like, oh my gosh, it got really hot for a second. It got heated. So don't put yourself through that stress. Don't do what I did.
No, that's so true. My husband is kind of the exception to the rule. He's constantly going to my cousin's house now that we're not that far away from her in the New York area. He's constantly going to her house and doing all of this work on it. The house was only built in the mid 20th century. There's just always so much upkeep to have to do with all these homes. So can only imagine for people in Baltimore, you do see a lot of the vacancies, you see
Yeah.
the board up windows. And, I think what you bring to the table is also this economic background, right? You're not coming at it from the traditional, I'm a planner or preservationist. You're
Mhm.
coming from it as I want to help people and I have this skill set and this knowledge and I'm
Yeah.
bringing kind of taking it in what I think is a pretty interesting paradigm shift in the way that development happens now. Could you tell
Yeah.
me like a little bit about just very briefly about your background and your educational background?
Yeah, I went to Northeastern University in Boston and I studied international business. My minors were in economics and East Asian studies. So I actually learned Mandarin Chinese. I lived in Beijing, China for almost 2 years. But in particular, I was really interested in learning how China was able to really kind of bring the entire country out of deep poverty through basically building the global manufacturing house of the world. So I was there for 2 years, came back, started my career on Wall Street. developed like a really strong background in financial modeling. So I would say like the combination of economic development and then financial modeling kind of helped with like how to speak the language of money while not being of money, if that makes sense. And I think that's the key is like the not being of the money. It's like how do you use money as a tool, but not as the ends. Like it's a means, it's not an end, at least for
Right.
me. And in terms of like to the earlier point you were making for our home buyers, they don't go through the okay, is my GC going to show up? Is my GC going to take my money? Like Parity absorbs 100% of the cost. So we buy the abandoned property, we renovate the abandoned property with our money, and then we sell the home to the home buyer once the house is complete. We do go under contract in the beginning, and there's a
Mhm.
small security deposit in the beginning, but the home buyer is able to pick a floor plan from our 4 standard plans. They pick their finishes and their selections. So they pick their chandelier and the pendant lights and their cabinet colors and the hardwood colors. And so it's like a new construction experience like Ryan Homes, but it's essentially new construction, but in a historic shell. So you have a new construction home in a historic material building. The other reason why that's really important, and we might talk about it later, but we're able to get historic tax credits because of that. And it's a game changer in terms of affordability for our home buyers.
Yeah, that's huge. I'm glad that you said that because I wanna ask about that, but I think before I do that, how much money have you been able to reinvest in the African American communities in Baltimore with your work, and how many vacant properties have you helped rehab?
Yeah. So we got our first kind of big grant from JP Morgan Chase in 2022. We were granted $2 million. We've received some other big grants as well, but let's call it 5 million in the last 3 years that totals acquisition of the 50 properties we own and then work in progress on the houses we've started construction on. So to date, within the 3 years, we've completed 7 homes. I would have preferred if that were 7D, like 10X, but I'll take seven because now there's 7 Black families living in those homes in a neighborhood where the block was vacant. Like the fact that there's cars on the street, like parked, is weird, you know? And just like seeing the buildings, I'm like, wow, these are beautiful. And it's also, interestingly, on a major thoroughfare. It's on Route 40, which in Baltimore is called the Highway to Nowhere. So it was an urban renewal project that tore down 900 Black owned homes, businesses, churches in the 60s to make way for a highway. On the other side, so that's West Baltimore. On the other side of the city in East Baltimore, where the highway was to connect, it was a predominantly kind of blue collar white community. They were able to mobilize and advocate and stop the construction of the highway. And although the Black community did the same thing, we mobilized, we advocated, we said, don't tear down our homes. They were still torn down. On the blue collar white side of the city, the homes weren't torn down. And so we now have what we call the highway to nowhere because it's essentially a stretch of road, but it stops. It like has a terminal instead of the original intention which was to be a highway. We build right on that, but the kind of paradoxical benefit is because there's so much vehicular traffic that passes by our homes. I think it's really signaling to passersby the Black communities are valuable, they have potential, they're beautiful if you preserve them the correct way. And I hope that it is I don't want it to be a calling card to the wrong people. Like y'all stay over there. Like you weren't messing with us before, don't mess with us now. But I do want it to challenge their perceived conceptions on the value of Black neighborhoods. And when they drive by, I want them to think, wow, like this is beautiful. And the people who live there must be phenomenal because we are. So but you had originally asked, we've raised, a bit of money. We have probably put 5 million so far into the neighborhood. This year we'll probably do another 7 million in construction activity. And then at a state level, I was able to pass an appraisal gap bill signed into law by Governor Westmore. So the appraisal gap is a phenomenon where in lower appraised neighborhoods, the cost of construction oftentimes exceeds what the bank will say the property is worth. So you might put $200,000 into a shell to make it livable. The bank thinks it's only worth 100,000. So you have $100,000 gap. And you could go to philanthropy to try to fill that gap, but it's hard. The appraisal gap bill was funded by Governor Westmore with $10 million per year for 6 years to put money into historically Black and redlined neighborhoods that have this appraisal gap because of systemic racism. And that 10 million will essentially create about 200 homes per year. So that'll be 60 million over the next 6 years. So really proud of that work, and think that is a national model for legislation.
Oh, dang. This is just insane. The amount of work that you have been doing. Like, no wonder people are starting to recognize what you're doing,
Mhm.
because you're out
Thank
there
you.
not just in the background, but also front facing and trying to like make this statewide change happen. One of the things that I admire about your work is that you're successfully bridging the gaps between the disciplines of urban planning, historic preservation, and architecture, and really economic development. Like, and you're doing this to help Black communities thrive. And that
Mhm.
seems like something both people in Baltimore and across the country are really responding well to the work that you're doing. I have found it hard to explain this type of paradigm shift to people, especially
Mhm.
going through my doctoral program and focusing a lot on this type of work. How have you been able to convince, especially funders and folks maybe with the city and the state, that this
Mhm.
is important work and it's worth investing in?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I myself don't really know why, honestly. I mean, actually, I guess I do. So, one is the power of Black women. Two, demonstrating proof of demand. And three, luck, I think. So, I come from finance. I was in venture capital. I know what it's like to be on the other side of the table when you're trying to like pitch an investor as to why they should invest in you. And I now sit on an investment committee where it's an organization that makes like small business loans to entrepreneurs. And I understand like the deliberations that happen in these rooms. One of my favorite sayings is, there's two of them. Number one, when it comes to raising money, everyone wants to be the first to be second, meaning that you will talk to 100 investors and they'll all say no until one person says yes. And then everybody else is on the bandwagon. And that is what happened with JP Morgan Chase. It took one person to say yes, and now everyone's like, "Oh, we love Bree, we love Parity. Well, yeah, we'll give you money," because JP Morgan Chase was willing to use their social capital, political capital, whatever you might want to call it, to basically throw their weight behind our organization. So that's one. The second like axiom when it comes to race and capital, when you are looking for advice, ask for money. When you're looking for money, ask for advice. And here's what I mean. The woman within JP Morgan Chase who ultimately lifted me up for that grant opportunity, she's a Black woman. Her name is Deqah and T. She's like one of my favorite people in the world. I met Deqah and T maybe back in 2018 or 19 when I was just starting Parity. I probably barely had the website. Someone put me in touch with her, and all I knew was that she was the program officer on JP Morgan Chase's philanthropy team. And with my first 10 minutes of the call, I'm like, "All right, so can you give me some money for my project?" And she was like, she didn't say this, but she was like, "Girl, I just met you." No. Like, she didn't say that, but it was basically like, you're brand new, give it some time, demonstrate some traction, and then come back to me. But we had that conversation, and a year went by. I had passed that bill that I talked about. I was
Mhm.
starting to really move the needle in some ways. I still hadn't raised a dollar, but I was demonstrating the viability of my idea. And she had been secretly just in the background watching me, just like watching what was going on. So, August of 2021, I'm sitting at my desk at home working, and I get an email. And the subject line says, "Opportunity to apply for a $2 million grant from JP Morgan Chase." And I'm like, "Oh, this must be a scam. These Nigerian princes are being very sophisticated." Because how do they know that this would be something I would click? And I'm like, "All right, let me make sure not to click any links in this email." But I verified it was an actual email. And it was because Deck and T had been watching my work. And so that's why I say, like, when you want advice, ask for money. Because the first time you meet someone should never be the time you're asking them for money. And
Yeah.
instead, the first time you meet someone should be to introduce your idea, your concept. This is who I am. These are the challenges and the opportunities. I would love your advice on how I should proceed. And when they give you advice, follow up with them in a month, 2 months, 6 months. "Hey, just wanted to say thank you so much for your suggestion. I implemented it. Here are the results." because people then are now emotionally invested in you. So the power of Black women in spaces, though, because Deck T, I mean, she's done this not just for me, but for a lot of people who have been working in obscurity for a long time. She's used her relative place of privilege to open doors for people who probably those doors would be closed otherwise. So the other thing is to build your like cabinet of evangelists and people who are going to be speaking your name in rooms that you're not in and lifting you up for opportunities that you're not privy to. And then the last thing, honestly, is luck. Because, like, at the end of the day, me being connected to Deck and T, her holding me in regard, I still had to apply for that grant. I still had to go through an interview process. Sometimes I feel like, man, I've just like the ancestors have been looking out and have been really blessing me and guiding my path. The last thing I'll say, I was able to demonstrate traction even without raising capital because part of our model is that I have this collective of people who saw the vision and they said, "Hey, Bree, if you can raise money, if you can buy these homes, and if you can renovate these homes, we would love to live on this block." And just having that kind of stamp of approval from 40 people was enough for me to go to a JP Morgan Chase to say, "Hey, if you give me this money, it's not going to go to waste because there's 40 people right now who are ready to move into these homes." So there's a lot that you can do in terms of having an MVP without having a ton of money behind you.
That's wonderful. It's great because one of my questions was going to be how the community has responded to the work. And it sounds like they were there from the beginning. They were there
Mhm.
championing you
Yes,
and this idea. And then kind of comes full circle where you're able to successfully accomplish the things that you said that you were going to do or that you set out to do.
exactly. And the fact that they've been there since day one, and in many ways, really helping me build the business, there is an increased sense of ownership. It's not just about owning the home. They feel like the Parity, like they also helped birth Parity. It wasn't just me. Like we all were hands on deck, sleeves rolled up. So you're creating evangelists for your work who again can carry it forward even if you're not able to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a good time to unpack what it means to be doing equitable development. And that is something that you also say that you are doing. You're actively like using that phrase. But the term from the research that I've done seems to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different
Mm,
people. Depends on how you
okay.
approach the work, depends on who's doing the work.
Hmm.
There's well, one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you about this is because I feel like you're doing what I call preservation-based equitable development, and, I mean, I think the preservation part is kind of like the okay, that makes sense. It's historic preservation, or you're kind of finding ways to reclaim the old, and or with the stories and the people that you're helping, it is about the history. But the term equitable development is I don't know if everybody quite understands what that really means. So I was hoping you could explain what you mean by equitable development, maybe talking about how you reinforce that concept through your work at Parity.
I might start briefly with a quick, just like sidebar as to my personal experience. So I mentioned that we began to experience gentrification, and then I kind of became a community activist. So I was kind of fighting against these big developers, white male run, multi-billion dollar corporation that was building luxury rental apartments in what used to be like the hood. And basically, just like, hey, if you're going to build 200 luxury units, can you set aside 10%? Bare minimum, right? Can you set aside 10% at, 30, 50, and 80% AMI, which is area median income? And can you hire locals to do the construction work? And can you talk to residents about what else they need in the community? Basic things. And just was met with absolute like disregard. Like, no, why would we do that? We already own the property. We already have the zoning rights and planning approvals from the city. We're going to do what we want to do. And so, again, a lot of my practice comes from having experienced like developers not caring about people who are there and in fact seeing Black folks as disposable and really just an issue to be worked around or to be pushed out. So for me, equitable development, I just asked myself, like, can we do development in another way? Does it have to be like that? And actually, it's funny. I think where it really dawned on me, I asked one of the developers to send me their pro forma, and they sent it not thinking that I knew finance or
Mhm.
how to read a pro forma. I asked them, like, do you have $50,000 to set aside for a park or something? And he's like, well, no, the numbers won't bear it. He didn't know that I understood the formula for IRR, which is internal rate of return. Their IRR was set at 25%, which is why, like, when the net profit was at the bottom, it was like, oh, we don't have money. If you turn the IRR from 25% to 20%, suddenly it's like an extra $1 million that they could have
Wow.
put into community. So that was like my first inclination that no, it doesn't have to be this way. And it's because of greed and capitalism and systemic racism and all those things. And so, like, when I started Parity, I just set out with the thesis, can we do development differently in a way that centers the lived experiences of people who are there, in a way that honors them, in a way that uses them as an anchor for everything that comes out of whatever development happens. Like, it's because of that's what they wanted and that's what they saw for themselves in their community. And for Parity, we not only do the housing, but I co-founded another, like, a sister company that's now being run by my co-founders, where we do anti-displacement services. So we provide wraparound support to people who are already in the neighborhood, who might be owners or renters, to make sure that they have everything that they need to stay in place. Whether it's like making sure they have an estate plan, making sure that if they're falling behind on their water bills or their property taxes, we have a small fund where we bail people out tax debt. Whether it's making sure, like, oh, you have a roof leak, but you can't, get a $10,000 loan to repair that roof leak, we'll get you a grant to repair your roof for you. I say all that to say equitable development is really, it's an ethos. I think it's a way of doing development. It's just a practice of care. And even with our home buyers are about a third from the neighborhood, a third from Baltimore City as a whole, and then a third people like me who are transplants who are maybe displaced from other cities. But we all go through a curriculum together where we talk about what it means to not be Black gentrifiers, or like to be intersectional Black folks, like really thinking about the fact that, all right, you might be a college educated Black person. That doesn't mean that your wants or needs supersede someone who's not college educated or someone who's lower income or whatever it may be. Like, if we're going to do this work, we are going to do this on behalf of all of us and not just a few of us. So, equitable development is really, for me, a practice of care in the built environment. I could talk also about the fact that we do some greening in terms of planting trees and just thinking about the health of our homes. We use low VOC paints. That's what it is for us. I'm curious how you guys define it.
Yeah. Similarly, essentially where you're able to put the needs of the community first. I really like what you said in your TED Talk about development without displacement.
Yeah.
I think that also really hits the nail on the head
Hmm.
because ultimately, if you're thinking about equitable development, you also need to reflect back and say, okay, so if we're doing this, then what was inherently inequitable about the development to
Hmm.
begin with?
Hmm.
So finding the ways to combat that and change how development is done, I think is really important. I take the extra kind of step for me is thinking about things historically and culturally. So the storytelling really comes into play with that. We often are also working with gentrification, urban renewal, economic disinvestment. These are all things that have created a very cyclical kind of economic and social divide. They've taken
Hmm.
wealth away from the communities, and what I think a lot of people are doing equitable development in a way that's almost like they don't think of it as saving as anything as much as just bringing the economic development into, like, these large developers don't come in it like you do. I think that's the difference, is they might just tear down to build affordable housing, and that might constitute equitable development for them. But the idea of driving home ownership is extremely important because people need to feel like they're rooted in the place that
Yeah.
they're a part of, the neighborhood, the social atmosphere. Having the
Hmm.
ownership is really, really important because otherwise you might leave, you might move. And so that permanence is really useful to families to help provide that generational wealth. It becomes useful in terms of thinking about what are the needs of the neighborhood, the people who live in this community? Are they in a food desert? Are they in need of services? What do we need to bring here? And so in some ways, for especially for like historic districts, I think Sweet Auburn in Atlanta does a really good job of trying to bring in Black businesses. So that's like one way of doing it as well.
Yeah.
And I find that really, like, the thing that you said about giving people the access to helping get their roofs repaired, doing the work that is necessary, because whether it is, a home that's 50 years old or 100 years old, these are things that people have to deal with, and these are things that can prevent people from being able to remain in their homes. That's how buildings get to be to a decrepit state, is when
Absolutely.
maintenance is deferred, and so if you
Mhm.
can't necessarily afford the maintenance or you don't know where to go to get the assistance that should be available, then it just creates that much more of a challenge. So
Mhm.
I really loved what you said about your sister company, because you can't really do preservation-based development without really thinking about those things, because it will
Mhm.
come into play.
100%. 100%. Absolutely.
Thank you for asking me what I thought. That
Yeah,
was
no, I'm
nice.
curious. No, but I agree that it's like a burgeoning, I don't want to call it industry. Let's call it like tribe of people
Mhm.
who get it. But I do see it more and more, and it's primarily Black, almost Black woman led. Like
Yeah.
we're bringing like the empathy and the care to spaces, like to development. We're bringing the expertise, but we're bringing the empathy at the same time.
Yeah, which is, I just think, something that is lacking in the
Hmm.
larger society today. I think especially because we're in a very precarious position
Hmm.
with the state of a lot of things. People don't know if they're going to have their job tomorrow or not. I think
Hmm.
all of that really comes into play. I mean, I wish that we didn't have to be thinking about that, right? I
I
wish we didn't
know.
have to think about how we would address that. But, I'm assuming the families get a mortgage to be able
Hmm.
to purchase the home.
Yeah, 30-year mortgage, like Bank of America, PNC, Truist, all those, like the large banks.
Yeah. I mean, how is Parity different from other real estate initiatives? Because your nonprofit model, I think, is pretty unique, and very
Hmm.
different from traditional corporate for-profit
Yeah.
companies.
So there actually in Baltimore, there are quite a few nonprofit developers. And part of that is because the numbers in Baltimore don't work because the markets have collapsed. The economic value has collapsed because of the hyper presence of vacants. So you almost always have to be, if you're doing the extremely hard work in neighborhoods with 80% vacancy and higher. And so, just to name a few, there's Neighborhood Housing Services or NHS. There's Black Women Build Baltimore, who you might want to talk to, Shelley Halstead. They build homes, but they train Black women homeowners to participate in the renovations of their homes. They're super cool. There's Northeast Housing Initiative, Knee So there's a lot of, in Baltimore, a lot of nonprofit housing developers. Oh, there's also Rebuild Metro, which is a big one in the city. In terms of how we're different from for profits, I would say that a traditional for profit, they are going to identify an investment opportunity. They're going to raise the money prior to demonstrating the market. They'll build the building. They'll usually put it on Zillow, MLS if it's for sale, or they'll rent it. So for them, the person is the afterthought. Like the end user is an afterthought. The money and the exit and the return is the primary objective and the primary guiding impetus. I think with nonprofit housing developers, the people, the community, that's the first thing you consider, making sure that whatever development that you're going to bring forward is in alignment with what the community and people want. Then you figure out how to make the numbers work based off of that. I would say we're different from other nonprofit housing developers in that we pre-sell our homes to our collective members and we allow our home buyers to kind of just like a new construction home building opportunity. They pick their floor plans, they pick their finishes. That's what makes us distinct. And it's more like we really lean heavily on the social fabric of things. We have like barbecues and game nights and Friendsgiving and like our home buyers are like best friends at this point. Like people hang out outside of Parity just because they have developed like these amazing friendships with one another.
That's pretty rad. I would be very excited to be in Baltimore when you've got some sort of event
Yeah.
happening. So behind the scenes, you mentioned a little bit about the tax credit opportunities, but I'm also thinking about both preservation opportunities and planning tools. What is some of the tools that you've used in those aspects to be able to accomplish the work?
So right now we're only using the city preservation tax credit. We looked at the state and federal, and I can talk a little bit why those didn't work for us. But at the city level, the historic preservation tax credit it essentially, and I know if like I was talking to the planning department, they would say that's technically not how it works. But for the layperson, which is me, it essentially locks in the pre-assessed property tax bill for the next 10 years. So what does that mean? If the assessed value of a building is $4,000 because it's collapsed, there's no roof, it's just a facade, and then we put in $300,000 of renovation work into it, and the post assessed value is now $300,000. Our homeowners, because we did the historic preservation property tax credit, instead of them having a property tax bill at the post assessed value, their property tax is locked in at the pre assessed value, which means that for some of our home buyers, they have like their taxes are like $800 per year or something crazy like that versus $5,000 per year. And for a lot of our home buyers, particularly because interest rates are so high right now, sometimes that tax credit is the only thing that is allowing them to afford the house. For every 1% increase in the interest rate, it wipes away $40,000 of buying power. And so it's like, but so much we can subsidize the house. At the end of the day, the interest rates are really capping people's ability to buy. And so that property tax credit is extremely important. Now, as the developer, we don't get any of the incentive. It entirely goes to the home buyer, even though we incur extra costs for it. So as part of the preservation work, we have to purchase wood windows, which are about $15,000 for 6 wood windows, but that it's a preservation requirement. Oh, and then we have these beautiful historic door surrounds and historic like hardwood, solid wood doors, which are like an additional $12,000. So what is that? $27,000 in additional historic materials. I mean, they make our homes look gorgeous, and I wouldn't trade it for the world, but it's $27,000 we put in as a developer that we don't necessarily get back. So for us, it's worth it. And it does make a difference in the way that the overall neighborhood looks because, I mean, they're historic neighborhoods and the craftsmanship is gorgeous. So I do feel really honored to be able to bring that back. And when inspectors come to like give us our final occupancy permit, they're consistently complimenting us on like our workmanship and the fact that we were able to preserve so much of the historic legacy of the homes. So yeah, I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, I think that's incredible, and then you mentioned that the state and federal tax credits didn't really work for you. I'm curious why that was.
Yeah, so the state credit, I wish it worked because the state credit is actually a check that the developer gets back. It's technically an income tax credit, but because we're a nonprofit, we have no income tax. So it would essentially just be a net benefit. But like this, if you think the city is like stringent on its requirements, the state is totally unreasonable to the point where it's not just onerous, it's actually in some ways I don't want to say harmful because like if someone from the state is listening, I love you guys, but like it's it's things like you can only use a single pane glass, like a window. Well, if you're thinking of like energy efficiency, you need a double pane glass to like help with the cold insulation. So if I'm doing a single pane glass, it's actually going to cause our homeowners utilities to go up. And how does that help them, and then it's also like the rear walls, you can only use like a certain dimension of lumber, but that dimension of lumber is more narrow than what we would typically use, which means that the insulation rating that we would typically put in these walls, because we're insulating against the outside, would be a lower insulation rating, which again would mean that utility bills will go up. So we decided, even though that would have been a net benefit to us and would have helped us with our costs, we decided not to do that because in the end it would have resulted in higher long term costs for our homeowners. And then the federal tax credit is, I think, only for like larger commercial projects that properties that have a very distinct like national historic value, which our neighborhood does not.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've worked on a lot of federal and state tax credits, and there are a lot of requirements that are really challenging. But one of the most recent tax credit projects I worked on was to help rehab a historic theater in a predominantly African American neighborhood in Cincinnati. There's so much back and forth between having to talk with the State Historic Preservation Office and make sure that you have all your ducks in a row. And there's a lot of competition actually for the state tax credits. So you could put in a lot of energy to do this work, submit
Yeah.
it, and ultimately it might not get approved. And so that becomes really, I think, a barrier to somebody wanting to be able to submit a tax credit. So it's really cool that Baltimore has something that's like very reasonable and that works.
Yeah.
And I also think that if you weren't thinking about this, like how the state and federal tax credit are not necessarily the best tools to use in some cases because it would kind of prevent that equity part from being a reality. Because ultimately it's the community and the people that you are selling these homes to who need to be able to live in their historic home.
Yeah, exactly. Without it being like cold and drafty and rickety and all those things.
Yeah, and it's a very real problem to have high electricity bills or heating bills. The flexibility that you get with doing the Baltimore city tax credit is also really important because you with a state tax credit and every state is different. Every state is very different in how much they want you to keep or not. But and this is actually quite a common criticism with preservationists. It's like, "Oh, you want to preserve everything exactly the way it was." And I think that is where we have to be kind of thinking about things differently.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think he's the director of planning, just sent out an email. He's been working on this for probably a few years now. He's
Mhm.
proposing something called conservation districts, which would be an attempt to kind of be in that middle ground of, all right, we care about historic preservation, but we recognize that sometimes the requirements are onerous. And if we are saying that we want to spark redevelopment in historically Black, undervalued communities, under-resourced communities that are not going to have the means to put in a $50,000 historic whatever. Like, is there a middle ground, or is there a way for us to still, you know, honor history without it being something that is inadvertently like upholding systemic barriers and systems of oppression? So this kind of conservation district kind of eases some of those requirements for the goal of mobilizing those tax credits for sparking redevelopment. It doesn't waive the requirements, it just eases them. So I'm really excited to see like if that manifests because I think that is going to be an amazing tool for equitable development.
Yeah, I think that'd be a game changer. Your work at Parity has been characterized as a systems change. Why do you think people have started to use that terminology?
Yeah, I think for a few reasons. And they might call it system change work because I call it system change work. So there's that. You just got to speak yourself into existence sometimes. There's a couple of like levers of systems change. There's legislation, so passing a law. There is obviously like getting to the root cause of some of the challenges, like really understanding why. Like one of my mentors used to always ask me, why are people poor? It's like we know people are poor, but why are they poor? And it forces you to like really assess like what's actually going on 10 layers deep that are causing people to stay in these systems of oppression. And because I came into this work as an activist, I really look at the root cause. Like what is actually going on? What are the systems at play? What are the processes or lack thereof that are keeping neighborhoods depressed and disinvested? And Parity's work, we realized it wasn't enough to just build the homes. We really like understand the entire mechanism that's at play here, and we're tackling every single cog of the machine. For example, acquisition. That's the first major challenge. It's hard to acquire these buildings because oftentimes they're owned by people who are deceased, they're owned by LLCs that are defunct. So even just getting site control is a systemic barrier. We figured out how to systemically move properties through the acquisition process more efficiently, which is how we got the 50 of them. So that's one thing. Understanding that systemically, Black folks, we might not have been exposed to home ownership, and we might be coming from behind in terms of our credit scores and our income and our savings. So we built a program that helps people become mortgage literate and ready to own a home. One of my team members is a former loan officer, so she actually guides people through the mortgage process. I can't tell you how many loans the bank actually initially tried to deny our home buyers until my team member, who has a decade of loan officer experience, was like, actually, you misplaced that decimal here in her loan profile, which is why you're trying to deny her this loan. Like, actually, she does have enough money. So, like, that's a systemic barrier that Black folks historically face that we're tackling. So, I think that's part of systems change work. We've passed the legislation that is actually moving dollars in real ways to communities. We are disrupting patterns of displacement by wrapping our arms around legacy residents, by building wealth. Our theory of change, like by building wealth through homeownership, our theory of change is that we're building for the next 7 generations. Like we're creating stability for the next 7 generations that will be kind of working collaboratively together to build power, like neighbors building power amongst one another. But maybe I'll leave it with this, and this is why I'm so excited about your work. Within systems are people. Like within systems of repression are good people, they're bad people, they're neutral, indifferent people, but they're people. And one of my favorite sayings is that when you tell stories, you change hearts and you change minds. And when you can change someone's mind about a place or a thing or an issue, or when you can like disrupt a pattern of ignorance of, or just like indifference or apathy, if you can change apathy to empathy, and you do it consistently, and then through stories you give people the tools to then be agents of change, even if it's just how they talk about a thing. I think that leads to systems change. If we are making equitable development a term that everyone understands and it's a popular term, then politicians are going to pick up on it because their constituents care about it. Corporations are going to pick up on it because their employees and their customers care about it. And suddenly like the major holders of power are listening to the wider populace, who actually are the true holders of power. So I'm really interested in how we tell stories, how we control our narrative to change hearts and change minds to lead to long-term system change. So that's why I love the work that you do.
Oh, thank you. I can't wait to see what kind of potential collaborations we could also be drawing up for the future. I know maybe ideally a
Yes.
Urban Roots episode in Baltimore, which is
Yes.
like that is
Come hang
something we've been
out.
trying to do for a while.
Yes. I'll have a real microphone set up and we can
We will bring it. Like if we yeah, we come
Okay.
out there, we bring it. Now, the last question I have is it's pretty much just like take me through what you feel like the rest of this year will look like for you and the future.
This year we'll complete 20 homeownership units for 20 households. Sometimes I feel it's not quite imposter syndrome. It's maybe just like, Bree, you should be 10 100,000% further than you are right now. I'm just really hard on myself. But I think when I get these 20 homes done at the end of this year, I'll feel like, right, I can pat myself on the back. Like the reputation that precedes me, I feel like I will finally be able to live up to it. Right now, I don't feel like I do, which is why I'm always like, no, like I don't want to be in the spotlight because I'm still learning. I'm still really trying to figure it out as I go. So end of this year, I think I'll feel just better about like where we are as an organization and what I can say we've achieved. But then we'll also be on that trajectory to 200. So like I mentioned, I want to get to 200 houses per year, 200 families per year. So we'll be firmly on that trajectory. And then also I kind of like want to be at a place where I can like step back a little. Like I start my days, I wake up at 4:30, and I'm pretty much going until like 7 or 8 p.m. and I'm ready to be able to not work that hard every day. It just means maybe I'll have a COO, a chief operating officer, maybe I'll have a chief of staff and multiple team members who can kind of run the business without me. So it frees me up to do what I do best, which is like visionary thinking, raising capital, kind of like big idea, big brain work. Yeah, so that's my goal by the end of the year.
That's very real. But girl, I think you're nailing. I think your work is super inspiring for me and
Thank
for
you.
other people I know in the planning preservation fields, especially for other Black women. Like, that's I think you're also very right when you were kind of saying having this, like, Black woman, like, leadership surrounding you is
Mm,
really, really important, and so, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and
yes.
share your amazing thoughts with the audience of Urban Roots.
Hmm.
And I look forward to everything that we're gonna keep talking about and doing potentially together or just, supporting each other in whatever ways we can.
100%. And I hope it was helpful for your audience or at least interesting and insightful. And now I feel like I have an extended tribe of cool people doing cool things. So thank you so much for this opportunity. It's a great way to end my Friday.
Thank you for listening to this Urban Roots podcast episode, and a huge thanks to Bree Jones of Parity. And thanks to our episode sponsor, the Loyola University's Maryland Selinger School of Business and Management. Your host is me, Deqah Hussein Wetzel. This episode was edited by myself, Connor Lynch, Vanessa Quirk, and Skylar Ficklin. Mixing by Connor Lynch. You can find us on Instagram at Urban Roots Culture or YouTube at Urban Roots Podcast. It also really helps if you give us ratings on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And we would really love to hear from you, so please do engage with us via your preferred podcast platform or via email, urbanrootspodcast@gmail.com. And as you probably know already, Urban Roots is part of the nonprofit Urbanist Media. And if you like what we do, we would love for you to consider supporting us via a donation. You can find us on PayPal and Venmo at Urbanist Media. And if you're a fan of Patreon, become a monthly subscriber for as little as $1 and get early access to new Urbanist Media content. That's patreon.com/Urbanist Media. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you for listening to Urban Roots, where we preserve place through story.